This is the part that Ray would normally give, but I will do my best to present the material for the forecast as well. One issue in forecasting, cellular adoption from the start has been what population are we forecasting into? So we started out, we actually were forecasting into cars, automobiles. And then we started forecasting into the population. Once it became obvious that people would use it personally, we started forecasting the population of people over the age of 16. And what, teenagers having cell phones? Shouldn't it be 21, Vanston? And we thought, but no, it's got to be 16. Because I actually had a slide from Clueless, the scene where the girls are talking on their cell phones and they kind of meet in the hallway, still talking together on their cell phones. So try to get across to people that, no, individuals would want that. And then it became the population to be the standard. And then at some point, in most countries, including the United States, the penetration went over 100%. And it wasn't because everybody had two cell phones. It had to do with multiple SIM cards and devices and laptops and that type of thing. So actually, if you look at the data, we're at something like 140%. This is from last year. I'll show you this year in a minute. But only about 87% of the population actually had phones. So that means that a lot of the connections have to do with things that aren't the one phone that somebody has, because 87 is where that actually peaked out. So some of that, of course, is people with multiple devices, but some of it is also things. And this is where the Internet of Things comes in. And to kind of break it down for you, the way we look at it in our forecast is you have the Internet of Things, which will be many billions of things that have some type of device communications in it. That kind of gets broken down to things that are not machine to machine, but are mobile at least, which is most of them. But about 10% of that will be something that involves mobility and so forth. So that gets us into the billions. And then about 20% of that will have some type of cellular connection that a cell company would be. So it's only a fraction of the total that probably involves most of the people here, or at least the ones in the wireless business, but they've still got hundreds of millions to deal with. So it's something to think about and to be forecasting. I think there's a misconception that M2M is only low speed, a few bytes a minute type thing, or very occasional. Some of it actually is that, but a lot of it could be very, very high speed, especially anything involving video or surveillance or security or things like that. Eventually, if the bandwidth's there, you may not worry about conserving bandwidth so much. You may be using a lot of it. Same with monitoring things like electric usage and so forth. If you just want to keep track of the 60 hertz power consumption on a very frequent basis, that could be quite a bit of data, for example. The geographical coverage might be very different than what we're used to, how people act. And then we need the low-cost, low-power solutions that we don't worry about. I mean, we charge our phones every day. Some of these devices in the Internet of Things need to be there for 10 years without a battery change. So their power needs to be less. A lot of the mobile things, need to have thousands of them. They can't cost $1,000 each to be economical. One thing about 5G is it was designed from the ground up to provide this type of service. Certainly the previous generations had the hooks built into it to provide IoT type services, but they were never really the first in mind. So getting back to our forecast, basically as from terms of standard connections like our cell phones that we carry around, that's actually pretty much leveled off in terms of penetration as we reach saturation. It's the M2M that's driving the growth. And so that's the red lines are basic forecast for that, and then add the two together gives our forecast of total connections that need to be provided. And that's what that is. And then I think many of you have seen this graph with the life cycles develop year after year over the decades. We had some ones like this that just was analog and digital, and of course every time a new generation comes out, we have another life cycle. And we used to break out 4G and 4G Advanced. Now we just kind of lump them together into one big category, being now replaced by 5G. And if 5G follows the patterns that we've seen other generations, the purple line is how that will look. And that's kind of like a macro forecast based on analogies rather than really getting down into the trees and figuring out what's going to happen this year, next year, and the year after. But based on history, it gives us the big picture view of what's going on. Gary Wiggins from AT&T couldn't be here this year, but I would be amiss if I didn't say what he always raises his hand up and says. There's one thing about this chart is this is a life cycle of an entire generation. It's not the life cycle of a particular asset. Because there are actually sort of some sub-generations of equipment that go on here within this curve. Also, you can't take the earliest point and the latest point as being the indicator of the life of any given asset. A much better indicator would be the midpoint here and the midpoint there, what would be typical. And that kind of comes up with, the lives of this equipment are such that they're reasonable to recover the investment that these companies pour into this technology year in and year out, but we're not incredibly long either. It's basically a game of investing a whole lot of money very frequently, serving customers with that technology for as long as you can, and then on to the next one, with no real insight to that. So there will be a 6G to come after the 5G. We're going to hear a lot about wireless from our other speakers, so I'm not going to dwell on that much more. That's our forecast. Ray and I will be happy to talk more about that and any of our other forecasts. So this is a few things that are implied by that. As I said, the mobile data is going to be growing much faster than connections per se. We're seeing much better cost performance improvement on the new technology. That's why we're making the investment. Our perception is 5G is the right technology coming in at the right time. So we'll be seeing some capabilities that have been there in one way or another in the wireless world, including IoT type connections and including very high-speed point-to-point broadband. But now is the time for those, I think, to really shine. So, any comments or questions at this point?
Could you go back a couple slides to the where you had the different generations? Yeah, this one here. So the greater cost per performance, is that sort of borne out in this chart here? It looks to me like each generation delivers a consistent improvement. In other words, you're not getting like a parabola kind of effect. It looks fairly linear from one generation to another. Are you saying that there's sort of an exponential?
Behind it, there's an exponential increase. I didn't bring we have another chart that shows kind of like the Moore's law of spectral efficiency. The amount of data you get per megahertz of spectrum, and that through space division multiplexing and better coding and all the things that they pour into these technologies when the time's right, has been get better exponentially. So basically, you're still seeing exponential progress driving these curves, but these curves are basically of the adoption. So basically, what happens is if you keep improving performance, that provides customers with better, cheaper service, that drives them to move to the next technology. And so we get these patterns of, this is basically more the connections, which is the subscriber side, but it's reflecting the exponential improvement. And it's the same way with the broadband curves and the wireline side. Those are driven by improvements in performance that tend to be exponential. Any other comments or questions? Okay, I think we're going to have a long break then.